Fuzz. What is about Fuzz that you like?
Well, I think it's a big part of it is growing up, my father's son, hearing the sounds of the 60s and the 70s, constantly like obsessing over those tones while I was growing up. And I think what it is for me as a child of the 80s and 90s who grew up on music from the 60s and 70s, I was constantly shopping for equipment at Guitar Center and on Musician's Friend and buying, tube screamers and rats and big muffs and things that were not vintage and germanium and did not sound the way these records I grew up with sounded. And I kept trying and trying and trying to get like the Clapton sound or the Beck sound or the Page sound and just failing and failing and failing and being like, where is this crazy like exploding chainsaw sound? Where is it? Where does this reside? And somewhere along the lines, I discovered, the gear page and, maybe in like 2013 or 2014, I kind of got on there a little bit and I started to see this fuzz section of the gear page and the pedal subgroup. And that was kind of the coolest place to hang out. Like I stopped kind of reading the rest of the forum. I kind of tuned out all the other parts because they all seemed like a bunch of people arguing about stuff kind of, and I just kind of went to the fuzz, and everybody in the fuzz place is happy and just talking about fuzz, and every clip sounds like the universe like exploding from the 60s. And I was like, maybe this is it. And I think I bought like, my first cool fuzz maybe in 2013 or 2014. I believe it was like the Ghost 2065 Mark I Tonebender kind of machine that Ian in the UK builds, and I got one custom made from him, and yeah, kind of that first like exploding Krang chord thing, and like my life changed. I kind of I was like, oh, fuzz, awesome. I was like, okay, cool. And then suddenly, one became 50 in the matter of like 2 years or something like that. I collected tons and tons of fuzz pedals and got obsessed with all these different circuits and all these different builders, and became really just enamored with the circuitry and the sounds and the community and the kind of like the culture surrounding these kind of weird treasured pieces of history and tone, how tone came to be. And I think somewhere along there, it kind of became like kind of a revered, or like kind of like it's like in this holy place for me. Like, it's like I love fuzz. I got obsessed and then it became love. And it's like, I think there's a lot of cool stuff out there that, you learn more and more about the different circuits, and there's so many obscure circuits that nobody has ever heard of. And like, it's cool because like you can buy 30 tube screamers and they're all going to kind of sound like a tube screamer. But if you buy 30 fuzz pedals, you'll get 30 pedals that sound completely different from each other. And there's very few things out there that are like that. It's hard to find that kind of like organic diversity in products. And I think that fuzz pedals have that organic diversity that's very like, you can try a bunch of them and they all kind of speak to you and pull different things out of you. Like, that's what I love about fuzz, is kind of like you'll play a crazy one and kind of like the act of fighting with it and then kind of bending to its will pushes you in new directions. And I find that very inspiring. It's very exciting. It's like riding the bull, or like, riding a race car that handles a little poorly. It's kind of, you feel it kind of sliding around on the track and you're like, I hope I don't die. Hope I don't crash and burn in the middle of the solo, but it's fun. So that's what I like about it.
Excellent. And is there any sort of artists, or I mean, you mentioned some builders there that you had, you've been, reading up on some builders and taking note of some other builders. There's some builders that you admire, other fuzz builders, and also, do you try and capture any sort of like artist tones in some of your builds?
I feel like what I'm always shooting for is kind of like, the classic sounds off the records that we all know and love. So I want it to sound, kind of like, I want it to sound like the heavens opening up and rock and roll exploding. Like I want it to be, I don't want you to strum my fuzz and be like, it's kind of like an overdrive. I want you to strum my fuzz and be like, that's rock and roll. Like that's kind of the goal here. And so I'm shooting for that kind of primitive, chaotic, organic, musical, but sort of nasty, weird energy that fuzz typically has kind of at its finest, I find, and I love the spectrum. Like, I think it's cool how like a fuzz face is kind of this, it's kind of warm, woolly thing that cleans up, but then like a Mark I tone bender is like a jagged, bright, nasty monster that doesn't clean up. I love the spectrum, but I find that there's got to be that common ground of kind of this like organic, kind of like, the note decay can't just be like an even thing. There's got to be some texture and some complexity going on in there. So I find that that's what I'm always chasing with the way I tune things, is kind of like a textural complexity that's very like pleasing to the ear and exciting to interact with, So that's what I shoot for, when I'm building mine.
Excellent. So talk us through a build. So when you receive an inquiry from a customer, what's the process and how do you deliver on their expectations?
Well, usually there's kind of this understanding when somebody is ordering something from me that it's because they want what I'm doing. That's why they're contacting me. They're not contacting me because they want something I'm not doing. They're contacting me because they want what I'm doing. So I tell them, hey, I'd be happy to do something that I do for you. What would you like? And then they say, I really like this. I really like this. Can you do something like this? And usually the conversation kind of evolves from there. And typically, I sort of do a pricing format similar to like, Analog Man, or like, kind of other old school custom builder options, where it's like you got the core circuit, and you kind of have a price point for the core circuit. And then, if you want like an LED in power, it's a little extra. And if you want like a bias knob that doesn't come with it, it's a little extra. And if you want the crazy paint job, it's a little extra. And if you want the fancy point to point, it's a little extra. So you just, it's like we've got you can order the cheese pizza, or you can get the Supreme Deluxe, it's but basically that's how you talk, how I approach each situation. And what I try to do is, no matter what anyone's ordering, I try to bring the same level of attention to detail and quality to the components and to the build. And so, because I just have a lot of fun trying to make everything, kind of as good as it can be. I think that's really important to me. I look up to a lot of people like David Maine and Stu Castledine and Ian Sherwin and Tim Cooper and Mike Timpson and Marc Gagnon and just like all these different people who put so much attention to detail. Like they want it to be perfect. They want it to be perfect every time, and I want my builds to be on that level. So that's why for me, no matter what I do, even if it's the most complex thing, it's going to be an undertaking. It's going to be, I'm going to be putting every ounce of what I've got into every single one, because that's, I don't want to send anything out the door that doesn't feel like that to me. I don't want to. So, but yeah, I mean, I've got a few here I can show you. Like, so
please,
basically, yeah. So basically, this is one that I recently posted on Instagram. This is the Zonk machine. And basically, what I start with is this enclosure, and I drill them, I drill them on my front porch, literally. So, that's my workshop. And then I take them to my paint studio, which is in the attic, in a corner, and I've got some good ventilation and a respirator, so I don't die. It's good. And then yeah, I take whatever the customer has sort of encouraged, or if they give me free reign, like I usually do like a classy, simple kind of hammered finish or something like that. But if they want something very elaborate, that's when I kind of do my best to get where they're asking me to take them. So, but usually they kind of say, hey, I love what you do. I want a beautiful, crazy finish, but just do it how you like to do it. And then I say, sure, like I'd be happy to. And that's kind of where stuff like this one comes from, where it's just kind of like, kind of a combine. This is like a hammered finish mixed with some other colors, kind of some other hammered colors mixed together. And you can get these really wild, kind of striking results. And people seem to be, people seem into it. So that's kind of just why I do what people ask me to do, but there's kind of an understanding that up to a certain point, it's out of my control. I spray the paint. It's art that happens. It's not necessarily like something I exert a lot of control over necessarily. But as I get busier and as I move forward, my goal is to kind of like streamline a little bit so that, perhaps in general, the things that I'm putting out are kind of a certain way most of the time. And that's kind of why like the custom finishes had to be at a different price point, because it became, you're doing 20 or 30 pedals and you're like, I got to do all these like weird little finishes every time. And it's like, I'd rather just kind of throw, a pretty gold finish on a box and say, look at that pretty gold finish. Yay, we're done. It's a little easier. So that's why it's a little cheaper. But basically, building them, you start with the paint, then you kind of tune the circuit. So you got your, you got your circuit board. I usually have the circuit board outside of the box, and I kind of wire it up as though it was going to be in the box to a test jig. I use the actual circuit that's going to be in the pedal with the actual components that are going to be in the pedal. But I have like a switch and some jacks that I use to test the circuit boards, that I kind of like modulate circuit boards so that I'm not constantly like, it just basically helps streamline the process of tuning. So I wire up the circuit board to my switching jig with jacks, and then I usually throw alligator clips on each of the transistor positions. Like you kind of cut the clips in half, and then you solder a little piece of metal to the exposed end of the alligator clip. So you have the clip end and then kind of like a little metal end, and you stick the metal end where the leg of the transistor goes, and you tack it in with a little bit of solder. And then you power it however the circuit demands, and then you start swapping transistors while it's plugged in and turned on with your switching jig. And what that allows you to do, and I think is really important, especially with germanium fuzz, it allows you to hear, is this transistor noisy? Is this transistor working? Because you can measure transistors for gain and leakage, and you can try to sort piles of transistors that tell you, hey, these look like they're about right for biasing the circuit. And they won't bias the circuit. They're noisy. And you're like, why is this terrible? And that's why when you're building germanium fuzz, it's really important to kind of do this. You tune each one by ear, and you audition transistors. You have to kind of like take large piles of transistors that are close to the correct spec, and then kind of rotate them musical chairs throughout the circuit, kind of waiting to hear what you're looking for. And then when you hear what you're looking for, you verify it with a multimeter. So you check the voltages to make sure that the bias is correct with the attack or the fuzz knob on full or on zero, or whatever voltages you're looking for. And that basically, that's the tuning portion. And then when the box is dry, you take your tuned circuit that has transistors successfully installed and tested, you take it and you install it. And what that does is it allows you to rule out, like, if you install a circuit board, you know, and then try to test transistors and it's not working, you may have an issue with your circuit, but you can rule it out by testing ahead of time, so that you know, like, oh, if it's not working, it's not the circuit board. I already know that's working. It's a jack, or it's a pot, or it's a switch. Because that, when you're building a lot of pedals all the time, you want to basically you want to make the likelihood of running into a situation where you don't know what the problem is, you want to reduce that likelihood as much as possible, kind of preemptively. So a lot of what I do is kind of preemptive, just preparing. You know, you got to get the circuit board prepared, get the box prepared, get everything prepared. And then after like 2 weeks of, you know, boxes drying and, you know, whatever, curing and, you know, this, that, and the other thing, finally you get to assemble it. And assembling it, you know, I would say from start to finish usually takes about an hour, 2 hours, you know, but the tuning takes a long time, and painting is also very stressful and time consuming. And sometimes the problem with painting is you get results you don't like, and then you have to like strip the paint, and that's really awful. And, you know, stripping and paint's nasty, like it's chemicals, and you're sitting up there painting is probably, of all of the things that I love doing every part of it, but I'd still say if I could get somebody to just paint me like a bunch of boxes, that would be cool. Yeah, if somebody else paint them and I'll fill them with pedals, that would be fantastic, you know, because that part's kind of hard, but you know, everything else is pretty fun.
Yeah, well, Ryan Edgecombe, in fact, who made that, he's said the same. He says the painting and the artwork, it takes so much more hours than the actual build itself. It's hard. Phenomenal amount of time.
Yeah, and with germanium fuzzes, there's the tuning that can eat up an afternoon pretty easily. Like you'll be sitting there trying to figure out why it's making noise and swapping transistors and not getting the sounds you're looking for. And sometimes it's just because you don't have something with the right gain and leakage, and you're looking and looking and you just don't have it in front of you. You know, so it's not going to work. and that can be very frustrating. You know, especially early on, I didn't have a very good, you know, very, very early on, before I started building professionally, I only had a few transistors, and I started out by trying to build the Mark I, which requires a lot of leakage in Q1. The leakage in Q1 turns on the rest of the circuit. It's basically essential to the circuit functioning. And the first transistors I ever ordered, germanium, were a bunch of Russian transistors with zero leakage. So I'm sitting here trying to build this Mark I. I'm like, it doesn't make any sound. It doesn't do anything. And Mike is like, your transistors don't have any leakage. It's not going to work. And I was like, oh. So yeah, you know, and then I got some more. Well, 100 leakage is good, but that's still not going to work, Pat. Oh, you know, skunked again. So I had to keep like, eventually you figure out, as you're kind of testing parts distributors and suppliers, you figure out the stuff that works for the circuits you're building, and that helps you put together parts orders that are productive, you know, that are going to help you. And that's kind of another one of the harder things, is learning parts that you like to work with, learning transistors that you like to build with, because everybody's different. You know, your tastes are going to be different. The transistors I use might not be the ones that everybody else wants to use, not because they're quality or whatever, but because the results you get depend radically on the specs of your transistors. So like, you know, you can get a germanium fuzz that cleans up, or is very gated, or is somewhere in between, or is kind of bright, or is kind of dark, just messing with transistors, not even touching capacitors or resistors, just alternating varieties of transistors. So the sensitivity of these circuits is something that I don't think a lot of people fully understand outside of the building community, and it's hard to convey that to like customers in a way that feels productive, because you're like sitting there trying to explain to them like, well, I could use those transistors, but it won't work. And they're like, why? It's a transistor. And it's like, well, gain, leakage, these things that are necessary for the circuit to function, you know, things like that. And so it gets weird. But at the end of the day, people see the products, they hear the sounds, they see other people having fun and enjoying the products. And I think that, the momentum builds, and, the work speaks for itself, and it becomes less about like, fulfilling some sort of vintage ideal, and more about providing people with like a world-class pedal that sounds amazing. It's less about like, I want it to sound like this recording or this guy. It's just like, I want it to sound amazing. I want it to sound like all that, and just I want it to sound like the best possible that I can make, like the best. If I'm making a Mark I, I want it to be the best possible Mark I, not like this one Mark I or like this other Mark I or like this recording, or, I just want it to be the best today, the best one ever made today, and that's, if I can do the best one ever made today, every time, I'm happy. There's no like recording or ideal that I'm shooting for. I just want it to be fun and perfect for me.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense.